Okay, hello everyone. This is Rebecca Power, your moderator for the day at the University of Wisconsin and the North Central Region Water Network. Welcome to The Current. The North Central Region Water Network is an extension-led collaboration among land-grant universities in 12 upper Midwestern states. We are looking forward to hearing from our presenters today on wetland values for water management, including the impact of agricultural activities on wetland flora and fauna and the other values of wetlands in agricultural landscapes. Before we introduce our presenters, a few notes to participants about the way these sessions work. You can see those notes there on your screen. Please submit questions for presenters in the chat box. The chat box is accessible through the purple Collaborate panel in the lower right-hand corner of the webinar screen. We'll have a dedicated Q&A session once all of our presenters are done. Typically, their presentations are about 10 minutes each, sometimes just a little bit longer, so we should have plenty of time at the end for discussion. A phone-in option can be accessed by opening the session menu in the upper left of the webinar screen and selecting Use Your Phone for Audio. So if you're having any audio issues, you can try to join the audio via that mechanism. As always, these sessions will be recorded and available at northcentralwater.org and learn.eextension.org. Okay, our presenters for today. Our first presenter will be Larry Chachacek, Professor of Soil Science at North Dakota State University. And he's going to be talking about biochemical differences in disturbed and undisturbed wetlands of the prairie pothole region. Dr. Jake Kirby, Associate Professor of Biology at the University of South Dakota, will be talking about investigating the impacts of agricultural tile drainage systems on wetland flora and fauna. And finally, Mike Monfils, conservation scientist at Michigan State University Extension, will be talking about some ongoing research that he's working on to inform conservation of wetland birds in the Great Lakes region. And we were having a little bit of a sound issue with Mike, so hopefully we'll get that resolved before we get to his portion of the webinar. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with Larry Chachacek. I won't read all these introductions to you, but we do provide these for you so you can see a little bit of the background of these folks that are presenting. Part of the purpose of this webinar series is to introduce you to a diversity of scientists and educators that are addressing water issues across the North Central region. And we are pleased to have Larry presenting with us today. So go ahead, Larry.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for all of you coming on and taking part in this session. What I'm going to talk about this afternoon is a study we are still trying to finish up. Gary Workmeister, who is a wetland specialist with NRCS in South Dakota, this is part of her PhD work. And I think Gary's on the line somewhere as a participant here. But this is a project we're looking at biogeochemical differences in disturbed and undisturbed wetlands in the prairie pothole region. Now, North Dakota is right smack in the middle of the prairie pothole region, and I'll kind of show you a picture here shortly of where it's located. But to give a little bit of background, what this work was about was we went and sampled 6 wetlands that were designated disturbed wetlands and 6 that were undisturbed, or putting it another way, those that were in very poor condition, very good condition, that were identified by Index of Plant Community Integrity, which was developed at North Dakota State by Sean DeKaiser and Christina Hargis. And they, a number of years back, undertook a classification of many of the wetlands in North Dakota. So the wetlands we were working on were wetlands that were actually identified by them as being either one or the other. The wetlands were seasonal wetlands, and which means that they were dry a good part of the year. They were not always wet all the way through. And what was kind of interesting was that we did the sampling in 2012, which was a very dry year, which allowed us to drive our Giddings Pro right in the middle of some of these wetlands. So the underlying consideration, the objective was behind all of this work was to look and see what biogeochemical factors we would need to consider if it was practical to restore some of these disturbed wetlands to their undisturbed state. And part of that is based on the fact that, you know, sometimes there's a need for wetland mitigation. Sometimes wetlands are actually deliberately taken out of cropland, and so what would it take, or what are the differences here that we might have to deal with if we were going to try to restore some of these disturbed wetlands? And the way to find that out is what are the major differences. So that's what we undertook. So this sort of orients you to where the prairie pothole region in the blue, it extends from central Iowa across southwest Minnesota, northeast South Dakota, through a good part of North Dakota, everything pretty much east of the Missouri River, excluding the Red River Valley of the North, and on up into the Three Prairie provinces up in Canada. And the area that we sampled is shown there in the Google Earth photo there. To orient yourself, the big black blotch there in the middle is Lake Kakawea. And there's a couple highways. The one running north and south through there is probably point is Highway 83, U.S. Highway 83 between Bismarck on the south and Pine Out on the north. This is part of the North Dakota Missouri Coteau, and that is sort of delineated by sort of the rough-looking area right down at an angle from upper left to lower right. It's kind of rough-looking, and the rough-looking means that it is very hilly, a lot of rolling terrain, and there are the black spots and there are black dots, and there are essentially wetlands, and a lot of them are permanent wetlands. Another thing I want to note is about the center of the Highway 83, toward the left side of the map, there's some lighter colored areas. Those are actually active coal mines in that area. So that gives you a little bit of an orientation for where we're at. So the work that we did was by taking our hydraulic probe and moving into these wetlands and sampling down to at least a depth of a meter where we could. And then using the wetlands sort of as anchor point, moving up the landscape on the landscape that seemed to be most typical of the landscape, and trying to get some samples up above to look at how the landscape is intersecting with the wetland. Now that part of the work we're still trying to finish summarizing that. So I'm going to focus primarily on the wetland itself. The cores were taken and encased in acetate contamination liners, taped up and stored at 4C in a potato warehouse. And then when we processed them, brought in the lab, they were sectioned to 10 centimeter increments, air dried, and then hand crushed to pass a 2 millimeter screen, which is what we would normally do for any soil samples that we collect. Now, some of these wetlands did have an O-horizon or an organic layer, but they were not consistent, so we sort of did not spend a lot of time working on those. But we were really interested to see what was in the soil of that, in the base of that wetland. We had to hand crush them because we were going to run multi-elemental analysis on them, and which is total analysis. And so in a lot of the analyses involved metals, so we had to be careful not to contaminate them with using a metal grinder. So we used plastic hammers, rolling pins, and a lot of hand labor to break these up. We took subsamples of these, milled them to 80 mesh, and we send them off to be analyzed for 60 elements by ICP mass spectroscopy after Acarita Digest, and that was sent to ACLAB in Ancaster, Ontario. We'll provide that service. So the sampling scheme is shown as the next picture here, and I'm focusing just on the wetland. I'm not going to talk about any of the other sampling that went on upslope from here. But essentially, in the wetland, we took 7 sampling points or 7 cores. 5 of them we used for analysis of various sorts, and 2 were for profile description to try to see if we could identify horizonation. But most of the wetlands were uniform enough, it's very difficult to separate out clear horizonation. One would think that because, especially in the disturbed areas, disturbed wetlands, which were surrounded by agricultural land, that you would have sediments clearly defining various layers in there that would be associated with various erosion events over time. So you can see the profile or a core profile off to the right-hand side. Now, the difference really between the disturbed and undisturbed wetlands was that the disturbed wetlands were in agricultural land, whereas the undisturbed were in rangeland. And the major differences really, based on the IPCI method, is looking at, are there native plants in these, are there not native plants in these? The disturbed wetlands, or the very poor condition wetlands, had at some point in time been farmed, dry trees. And so there had been some agricultural disturbance. The agricultural lands in this area have been cultivated for 100 to 120 years. So there's a lot of time, plenty of time has transpired to have some major impact on. But once we got all our analysis done, we started looking, trying to figure out how to do it, all this mountain of data we had. And one of the things we did, first things we did was look at using RDA analysis, redundancy analysis, where the data is normalized, or the data that can be normalized, and then plot in a spatial plot. These are 3-dimensional plots, showing top center is the combined data for both types of wetlands, and then looking at the disturbed wetlands and undisturbed wetlands separately to see if there are any differences. And as you can see, there are differences. And some of the things to note, one of the things that this analysis separates out environmental variables, sort of the background things. If you look at the combined data, you can see electrical conductivity up here in the upper right corner, organic matter down here in lower part, depth upper left, clay, and somewhere in here is a site. So these were the main ones. They made up about half of the variation of all of the variables in this data set. And then the smaller areas are various elements, and the arrows sort of indicate kind of where they fall in. Do they fall in with the EC or the organic matter or the clay, some of these things. When we look at the disturbed wetlands, we see that, you know, everything sort of shifted in a very narrow band here, almost directly to the left of center of the plot. And you see organic matter's moved up here to the top from the bottom, and EC's moved not far, but pH pops up, depth pops up, and bulk density here is also a factor, environmental variable. And then we look at the undisturbed. Now organic matter shifts to another place here, EC shifts elsewhere, sand is up here, and then also site and pH. So we knew that there's some things that were important here. Number one, depth was important. The salinity and pH were important. Organic matter was important. That there were some effects of depth, and the site was basically, was it you know, site A versus site B, you know, inter wetland or intra wetland differences. And so I'm not going to spend a lot more time on that, but I'll talk a little bit about some of the classical approaches that we use, and I'll talk a little bit toward the end, summarize the elements, elemental data. Now this work has just been published in Wetlands magazine, and I'll give you a reference at the end of this presentation. But one thing we found out that the pHs were higher throughout the profile in the disturbed wetlands than the undisturbed wetlands. And we think this is probably due to erosion of calcareous tills. Most of the glacial tills in this area are calcareous. Also, the disturbed wetlands are in cropped lands, and we've basically taken these lands out of a permanent cover, grassland cover, and put them into a short season small grain or other crop covers, so that there tends to be more leaching, more percolation of water into the profile, and when it reaches a restrictive layer, it moves laterally and moves and may purchase the water table, and then the water moves into the wetlands. Now these are not highly weathered soils, so they're rich in nutrients, and so we've got a lot of salinity problems in our part of the world, and part of that is because we've got young, unweathered soils, and these nutrients, the salts tend to move with the water, so that sort of indicates the fact that we've probably got a different source of water in these disturbed wetlands than we do in undisturbed wetlands, from the standpoint that it's flowing through the soils and impacting the local water table. We also see the same thing with salinity here, and we found that the disturbed wetlands had higher salinity. Again, we think this is the reason it's higher, is because we've had movement of water off the landscape, and also through the landscape into these wetlands. The next slide shows clay. This might give us a little bit of an indication of how much sediment has been deposited in the wetlands. You see the undisturbed wetlands has got a bulge at about 40 to 50 centimeters below the surface. And if you look at the disturbed, there's a couple of different squiggles here, but it looks, the comparable bulge is probably about 60 to 70 centimeters below the surface. So that means we've probably got 20 centimeters or so of sediment that has been deposited in this wetland, pushing that bulge down. We also see some higher clay near the surface, and this is very likely due to local erosion off the landscape, because most of the topsoil has already been removed, and basically what we're moving into the wetlands as sediments now are clays from the B horizon that overlies the landscape. Organic matter was lower in the disturbed wetlands than undisturbed wetlands, probably because of disturbance over time, plus also a change in vegetation. Very few native species, mostly cattails or weeds, and these may or may be intermittent depending on where there's water in the wetland or not. So these are some of the things that, from the classical sense, we think is going on there. We're pretty sure it's going on there. Now, when we look at the multi-element relationships, the group we've been working with they're part of this, were our wetlands ecology group, Dr. Marina Saudi and Dr. Donna Jacob in biology with the wetlands ecology group, and they've done a lot of multi-elemental analysis of wetlands. So when we had the total analysis done, we got somewhere around 60 elements that were analyzed. 10 of those elements were below the detection limits of the methodology, so those were not even considered. Excuse me. Using RDA and correlation and other analysis, we had 28 elements that showed no significant differences between either wetland. But the remaining elements showed either a positive or negative relationship, and all of it seemed to be related with the clay content in the wetlands, the organic matter, or the salinity based on their chemical reaction in the soil. and even though some of these were not significant, and some of the significance we had to look at using non-parametric tests like Kruskal-Wallis or Friedrich tests, rather than the classic ANOVA tests. There are some things that are going down throughout the profile. We found that our classical method showed that we've got impacts down to 60 centimeters, but the concentrations of things like calcium, barium, strontium, niobium, lanthanum, promethium, tellurbium, bismuth, and thorium showed differences that apparently are because of disturbance. And so there's a lot we don't know about these things yet because we haven't looked at a lot of them. A lot of people, they haven't been studied very well. So there's a lot of things that are that we've learned, but we don't know much about. So this is ongoing. We're also looking now at the fringe areas, and one of the things we're kind of interested in is looking at, can we use that as a proxy for these wetlands for sampling to see if we can, figure out some of these differences that might be used, because sometimes it might be easier to sample in the fringe rather than in the wetland. When you got water covering the soil surface, it's kind of hard to pull cores out of that. So there's some other things we're looking at. I had a question pop up here. Why is there a difference in the vegetation? Why are cattails and these types of species that are growing in disturbed wetlands, why does that cause a reduction in organic matter? Part of it is the fact that it's not covered by vegetation all of the time, so there's not any biomass going back into these wetlands. The other thing, part of the time it's dried out. Organic matter oxidizes if you're not having inputs. Another reason is that there's tillage occasionally. If a farmer thinks he can grow a crop in there, and probably more so in the past than currently, they will try to plow through it, and so that disturbance itself breaks down organic matter. So that sort of shifts the organic matter to a lower level. Whereas if you've got a natively vegetated wetland, which has got rushes and sedges and other types of species, wetland species, you've got a constant ground cover or constant biomass production in these areas, and so you'll tend to maintain your organic matter. The paper that let me back up here, is one I've got here. It is in the first look part in the Wetlands Journal. For those of you who are interested, can look it up. There's the DOI on it. And at this point, I'm pretty well done, and I will finish up here, and I'll wait for questions later. Thank you. Thanks for your time and attention.
Great, thank you so much, Larry. And again, go ahead. I seeded the chat box there with a question that I had, but go ahead and put questions for Larry and the rest of our presenters in the chat box, and we'll move right on to Dr. Jake Kirby, Associate Professor of Biology, University of South Dakota, and talking about the impacts of tile drainage systems on wetland flora and fauna. So go ahead, Dr. Kirby.
Thanks a lot. So yeah, so we'll switch gears a little bit here and talk about some more of the biota and impacts, mainly looking at these tile drain systems and sort of what impacts they may or may not have on wetland flora and fauna. This is a huge project I've been working on for the past 5 years. I have several graduate students working on it, also collaborators from my department and from the state. So there's a lot of components to it. I'll probably raise a lot of questions that I may not actually have the answers to yet, but nonetheless, I think it's sort of an interesting and important topic to hit upon. Lots of support from different agencies to do the work. In particular, I want to thank the Fish and Wildlife Service for letting us sort of investigate these questions on their lands, and also for funding for the first part of the project, and then South Dakota Game Fish and Parks for funding the second part of the project, and also allowing us to use some of their wetland space as well, and a huge sort of monster host of undergraduates and grad students. So mainly what I'm going to talk about here is these tile drain systems. So I think most of you might be familiar with tile drains. Basically, they're used by farmers to improve the yields of the crops. They mainly do this by draining off standing water or decreasing soil moisture level for their sort of drought-resistant seed. And it allows you also to remove small ponds and things like that, so increasing the area of which you can farm the land. A lot of this is then, so the water sort of escapes into these plastic corrugated pipes, which are all interconnected, and then enter into a tile drain outfall, is what we call it. And that often leads into a lower area, so a wetland area. A lot of interestingly enough, we don't necessarily know a lot about what the impacts of that is. There's been some kind of information about, out there, when you watch some of these shows, that they say you can stick your glass under the tile outflow drain and drink the water. It's so clean, and obviously that seems a little crazy, but we want to look and see what's coming on, what's in that water, and does it have any impacts to the surrounding wetland area. So that's what this study is mainly about, looking at the water quality itself, what's in these wetlands, and then also how it might be affecting the biological communities. And there's a variety of kind of different factors that we'll look at to sort of talk about those impacts. What the study was designed to be was this field study, and so basically we have three different kind of treatments. So we picked wetlands. These are either waterfowl production areas from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service or game production areas by the state that had sort of different surrounding either grassland buffers, and we can call those control or reference sites, or other sites that had sort of surrounding agriculture. And so there was surface runoff either directly from the farms or through drainage ditches and things like that. And then the third category was the tile sites themselves. So these are basically surface sites, but they are receiving, in addition, an outfall is either adjacent to the wetland or emptying kind of within a few feet of where that wetland is. We looked at it. This is across eastern South Dakota in these prairie pothole regions that we saw earlier from Larry's presentation. And we sampled these at 3 different times, May, June, and July. Here I have on this screen the 18 sites we did in those 2 years, but we also swapped out 6 of those sites to put in game production area ones for the 2015 and 2016. So some of the stuff that we looked at, and I apologize, these slides look a little bit off kilter, so if there's some error there, hopefully you can see it. But basically, we did one thing where we did a South Dakota wetland rapid assessment protocol. This is developed by South Dakota State, folks up there, that basically we're looking at an indice, a rough index of how to assess a good wetland versus a poor wetland, really. And so it provides you with an actual number that's more or less a qualitative assessment of lots of different types of things. So things about the size of the wetland and surrounding land use, connectivity to other water bodies, that sort of stuff. But also looking at the hydrology and how it's been altered, as well as vegetation and other sort of general. But this is really designed to walk up to a wetland, maybe fill out this, several pages of kind of information, but it might take 10 minutes to do. So a really rapid idea of getting a good assessment. And it does a fairly decent job for what it's trying to do. What we used it for is to gather these scores from this protocol, though. And so there you can see on the left, we basically are looking at different ratings on this index. And you can see, not surprisingly, that our control sites were better quality wetlands, as you would imagine. These surface sites were much lower in quality overall. But most interestingly, these tile sites had the lowest scores of the 3 different groups. And we'll talk about why that is in a second. But that's basically sort of showing you that these things are capturing differences in the overall quality of these types of wetlands. So there's something kind of holistically different about tile sites that make them score lower overall. Of course, there's lots of different components that are playing into that. We'll look at some of those in this presentation, but there's still a lot of questions to be answered, frankly. Again, so these RAP scores, they're actually changing over time because part of it is measuring vegetation, and so some elements of vegetation are indicators of good wetland versus bad. And so in May, you don't see much vegetation out here in eastern South Dakota, so that grows through the year, so you see those things changing. But what's interesting is that if you look at the sort of combined graphic here, that you can see through time, surface and tile actually initially start out with fairly similar RAP scores, and surface slightly improves a little bit better versus tile. So and depending on the year you look at, some of those tile sites don't improve much at all in terms of the overall RAP scores. So, and again, indicating some significant differences, I think, between just agricultural wetlands surrounded by agriculture versus these specifically influenced by these tile outfalls. This slide looks a little bit cut off on the bottom. But basically, some of the things you can see in terms of the differences between tile sites and surface sites. One is that basically in a lot of the RAP scores, you mark down things like, are there floating species present at the site, in a certain proportion of the area. And it looks like in tile sites we see things more like duckweed, and we also see less submergent vegetation, and presumably it's things like duckweed is being choked out. And also higher levels of algae, sedimentation, these sort of things are all kind of linked together. So these are all contributing to these differences in these RAP scores. So ultimately then what we're interested in, the very last year of the survey we were able to work in a plant ecologist, and so we did some extensive kind of vegetation surveys, which we're still sort of working the data out on those. But one thing to show you here, it looks like the standard error bars didn't pull through here, but basically these tile sites are significantly lower in diversity when we look at things like the emergent zone vegetation. So seemingly less submergent vegetation and different types of species are in our tile sites. So for instance, at surface sites in these emergent zones, we would see things like bulrush and native species of cattails, versus tile sites we tended to see less bulrush, if any at all, and more of the invasive types of cattails, things along those sorts. So again, a lot of this stuff is early and we're still sorting through it, but nonetheless we're able to pick out these patterns pretty clearly. Additionally, what we looked at were the actual chemicals coming out of the pipe. So we worked with a host of different labs to get these numbers. What I'll show you here in the next few slides are different. So these are the different wetlands types that I talked about. Those are water samples basically taken from those wetlands themselves. And then the last column there is what we measured from the tile outfall itself. And so you can see that the nutrient load coming out of the tile is fairly high. So on there I have some sort of standard, suggested concentrations of which these things should be below by various sources. And you can see the tile outfall sort of exceeds all of them on average. So some of these were really high, in fact, that we saw coming out of here. And so things like nitrates fairly, travel well through the water. So we see those. Other things I won't show you here, phosphates tend to bind to the soil, so they're not coming out of these outfalls. So lots of differences that are occurring, but presumably those are contributing to the wetlands itself. And so you can see the tile wetland, again, sort of larger bodies of water, but nonetheless, when this tile is flowing into it, it's going to affect the overall conditions. And so tile, you see, have slightly elevated levels of nitrate compared to these surface sites. If you look at other things like neonicotinoids, so this is an insecticide. Out here where we're looking at, it's pretty commonly used as a seed coating for things like corn. So the farmers can buy the corn already pre-treated with these insecticides. And they're sort of put into the ground. And so we wanted to look and see, are these coming out in the water? And again, we can see fairly high levels coming out of the outfalls. Once they get in the wetlands, in part, some of these mechanisms we don't know, we haven't done the experiments on, but it would draw to reason that a lot of it is just being diluted because it's a bigger area of water. A lot of things like neonicotinoids break down fairly quickly as well, so there's some breakdown aspect. And then other things we can see maybe being absorbed by the different flora and fauna in the water. And so anyway, we can see again, overall slightly higher levels in these tile wetlands as opposed to the surface wetlands, but definitely a lot of it coming out in these outfalls. The last contaminant I'll show you is selenium. So this is a naturally occurring element in our South Dakota soils, but again, incredibly sort of high levels coming out of the tile outfalls and translating into higher levels within the tile wetlands themselves. And so you see, again, it happens to be in these other wetland types, but the tile one is significantly higher than the other two. So these are sort of the things we're measuring coming out of the pipes. What effects might they be having? So in these same different categories of wetlands, we measure things like aquatic inverts. And so if we look at particular insects overall, or even incorporating, as we have here, snails and other things, interestingly, our diversity scores are much low in the tile wetlands. Whether that's directly because there are higher insecticide levels in those tile wetlands is not clear if that's the direct mechanism, because otherwise I can show you on the right there, we can also see the index or the diversity is lower in different vegetation types. So these tile wetlands also tend to have more substrate in them than emergent or submergent vegetation. And so it could also be indirect mechanisms as well. By altering the vegetation, there's less habitat for a lot of these aquatic inverts. So again, it's raising more questions than we know, but what's important to note is that there are differences in these diversities, and there are lower diversities in these tile impacted sites. Beyond that, we also looked at actual, not just bugs in the water, but a cool addition to the study that a colleague of mine helped with was looking at things coming out of the water. So things like chironomids, for instance, are emerging from these wetlands and are very important food sources for things like frogs and baby ducklings and that sort of thing. And so we can see changes in abundances depending on the timing of these things. So at some of the tile sites in June, we have lower numbers of chironomids. But even more importantly is this slide here, where you can actually see that those, so we captured those things as they came out of the water with these little trap nets. And then we sent them in to be analyzed for levels of selenium. And interestingly enough, we have higher selenium in the water, and so it would make sense. We actually are seeing higher selenium in these emerging insects. That has a pretty important implication in the sense that we're pulling selenium from the soil and moving it into the terrestrial food web. Again, opens up a whole sort of host, I think, of interesting questions there. But at pretty high levels is what we're seeing in some of these samples of these insects. So some things for concern, I think. Why do we think maybe these contaminants are moving forward? I mentioned nitrates already, pretty mobile in the water, so that could easily move through the soil. The implications of just these putting pipes in the ground, you can just sort of start to intuit things that would happen. You're mobilizing a lot of these things that might normally be trapped in the soil in some way. Neonics, I think were originally touted to be seed coated. It's great because then you don't have overspray and have to worry about all those types of spraying. You can put them in the ground. But if there are pipes somewhat, directly below them, then any of that water that's infiltrating through the soil can then basically carry these insecticides into these pipes and very easily then move them into these wetlands. And selenium, again, these lower, as we go lower in the profile of the soil, a lot of the selenium in the top might already be, sort of utilized or moved around, but these lower soil levels are sort of moving this stuff around, I think, at least here in eastern South Dakota. Lastly, I'll just sort of highlight the one thing we also looked at were amphibians in terms of the higher trophic level impacts. Because we measured diversity as one thing, we only have 4 species at these wetlands, so it's hard to track changes in diversity. Also, amphibians are notorious for having high variation in abundances, so it's hard to actually compare abundances from year to year and control for that well. So we don't see significant differences, you can see. But again, just sort of looking roughly at this map, you see that same sort of pattern looking emerging. So with all that, we're basically trying to push forward a little bit. We have lots of different lines of evidence that these tile wetlands are qualitatively different through the overall RAP scores, looking at different vegetation. The contaminants that are coming out the tile outfalls are high, and important ones are sort of influencing those. We see differences, particularly in the insects, and so assume at other levels of biota we're having impacts as well. But again, what the exact mechanisms are still questions that remain. Is it directly from the contaminants? Are there indirect interactions that are occurring? There's lots of sort of questions that kind of arise. So with that, we're basically spending the year. I just finished my PhD student defended, so we're working on getting these data finalized and published, as well as a master's student will finish the next few months here. we're getting all that out, and then also we just had a meeting with Ducks Unlimited trying to get some more funding to look at these connections in this food web as well and see if we can sort of make some of these more mechanistic connections and try to understand what's happening. With that, yeah, we also have some final reports coming out and publications that I can share as those things come out later on. So I think that's it with my time, and I'll answer questions later on. Thanks.
Whoops, I think I had myself on mute. So what I said was thanks, Jake. Great presentation. And, you know, as long as I've been doing this, still the technology can get in the way. So why don't we go ahead and move on to Mike Monfils, conservation scientist at Michigan State University Extension. Thank you, Mike, and go ahead.
Thanks. Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Loud and clear. Perfect.
Okay, great. Thanks. Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you all for connecting in with the webinar today. I'm going to try to give kind of a quick thumbnail sketch of some of the work that I've been doing with wetland birds in the Great Lakes region, research and monitoring that's aiming to address knowledge gaps with these species and help inform conservation decision making, especially at the state and regional levels. So I want to start out just by kind of summarizing a little bit about why birds use these wetlands. Often wetlands can be pretty high, have high productivity, which means a lot of abundant resources for birds, and such as food resources. The dynamic nature of a lot of wetlands with fluctuating water levels creates a lot of gradients in water depths, leads to zonation in the plant communities, and that results in a lot of different microhabitats that these birds can take advantage of. And it also can lead to a lot of different species using the same ecosystem through having different niches. So these wetlands provide the food, the nesting sites, the rearing sites for young that they need, and often pretty high diversity and relative abundance in wetland types such as freshwater marshes. So before I get into too much detail, I wanted to just talk a little bit about what I mean when I say wetland or marsh birds. This is just a common term that biologists like myself tend to throw around. But really I'm talking about obligate wetland bird species such as bitterns, rails, coots, gallinules, and grebes. These species that really depend on wetlands and spend their whole life cycle within these ecosystems. And they're a bird group that we really, there's much that we don't know, especially compared to other bird groups such as waterfowl or forest songbirds or grassland birds. These birds just haven't received as much attention as some of the other bird groups, so there's still a lot we don't know. So why are we concerned about them? Well, again, we have a lot of knowledge gaps, but we also, what we do know about them, there's a lot of indications that their populations have declined over the last several decades. And that could be related to wetland loss, wetland degradation through things like eutrophication and the expansion of invasive plant species. But the end result is many of these bird species have received special designations, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this table, but it kind of summarizes the status of some of the primary target species for marsh bird surveys in the upper Great Lakes. And you can see that a number of these species are focal species for the upper Mississippi River and Great Lakes Region Joint Venture, for the Regional Waterbird Conservation Plan, the Audubon Society. Many of these species are threatened, endangered, or special concern at the state level. And all of them are a species of greatest conservation need in at least one of the few states that I've listed here in the state wildlife action plans. So what we have are species that we still have a lot we don't know. They seem to be declining, and they're of high conservation priority. So that gets into some of my research that are I'm working with a number of collaborators from throughout the Midwest that we're trying to address some of these knowledge gaps and learn more about these species so that we can conserve them in a more efficient and effective manner. So I'm going to just run through a few of the ongoing projects that I'm working on. And the first is a project where we've been working to evaluate marsh bird habitat associations at fine and large spatial scales. And here I show it as being ending in 2014, but it's really a continuing project that we're trying to update analyses using additional data and move this toward publication. But what we're really trying to do here is look for habitat associations where these birds occur in the landscape, and try to better understand, is their occurrence driven by factors at the landscape scale, at the very local or wetland scale, or a combination of the two. And by learning more about these habitat associations, we'll be able to better, more effectively plan and implement conservation work. So that's a project that we're continuing to move forward with. Another one that I'm working on wrapping up right now, I'm finalizing data analysis and preparing our final report, is we're trying to look at marsh bird response to hydrologic alteration and restoration. And what we've been doing is comparing marsh bird use within several wetland types. Altered, which could be flooded through water control structures or partially drained through surface ditches, restored or rehabilitated wetlands where we've had things like ditch plugs or dike removal in coastal wetlands, and comparing the use of those sites to reference wetlands, which are still in relatively good condition. And along with that, we're trying to investigate possible habitat associations. So if we're seeing differences among these different wetland types, try to understand what might be driving the differences. What is it, a particular habitat component that might be driving those differences? So this work has been focused on in what we call BCR 12, or the boreal hard to transition zone, which is the blue highlighted area. And we've been working in Seney National Wildlife Refuge and a couple of state wildlife areas in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, as well as using data from the Michigan Marsh Bird Survey, which is a statewide survey. So we're wrapping up analysis on that and should be completing that very soon. A similar project that I'm working on with collaborators from Ohio and Wisconsin is to look at marsh bird use of impounded wetlands compared to unimpounded wetlands in these three states, Michigan, Ohio, and Wisconsin. And the goal of this project is to see if these impounded wetlands, which are just wetlands that have been flooded using water control structures, managers manipulate water levels up and down to maximize habitat for things like waterfowl or ducks and geese. So we're trying to compare the use of those wetlands with unimpounded or more natural wetlands to see if there's a difference when we look at these secretive marsh birds. To see, does managing for waterfowl benefit these marsh birds? Do they not prefer these sites? Is there no difference? Knowing that will help to managers to tailor management for not just waterfowl, but some of these declining marsh birds as well. And this just shows this graphic here where these marsh bird survey points that we've been using for this project, where they occur in the three states. So we have, I believe, around 750 points that have been surveyed since, off and on since, I believe, 2008 when Wisconsin started their survey. So we have a good amount of data to go to look at this question. The next project that I recently started with several partners throughout the region is to try to develop population estimates for some of these secretive marsh birds in the upper Midwest. We don't have a good sense of how many of these species are out there, or how many of each species, what the population size is. We also don't have a sense of what the trends are. We think they've probably been declining over time, but they could have stabilized. We really don't have a good sense of that. And now that we've been collecting some of this marsh bird data, we want to try to develop a mechanism for estimating population sizes so that we can start tracking these populations over time. And that also has a nice tie into the conservation work that's being done on throughout the region, and so that we can start to see if those conservation efforts are having the desired effect of increasing population levels. And it's similar graphic to where what I showed you before, but we've added Minnesota into this project because they started their marsh bird survey a couple of years ago. So we have, again, good coverage across the upper part of the Great Lakes, and this is something that we'll be working forward on over the next couple of years. Now, the last project I'll mention is one that we started late last year. We're just getting going with the first field season. I was out doing bird surveys this morning, in fact. And we're looking at the effects of invasive Phragmites and control efforts on bird and plant communities in the Saginaw Bay. And Saginaw Bay is on Lake Huron. And what we want to do with this project is to compare marsh bird use and plant communities among managed Phragmites, unmanaged Phragmites, and reference sites. Phragmites is the invasive form of Phragmites is a massive problem in the Great Lakes region, as with much of the country. But especially in these coastal wetlands, we've seen a dramatic increase in Phragmites over the last 10 years or so. So we want to try to understand what effect that has not only on the bird community, but the plants, and see if some of the management efforts that have been going on in this region are having the desired improvement to these communities. So this graphic here on the left just shows where our study sites are on Saginaw Bay, and we actually have a few more that need to be added to that. And then the graphic on the right is just for your edification. If you haven't ever seen or been in Phragmites-dominated wetlands, this gives you a little snapshot of what it looks like. It's pretty dire when the species takes over and creates a monoculture. And that's kind of the whirlwind tour of the work that I've been doing with many collaborators and many people who have devoted a lot of time to surveys over the years. So I will leave it there, and I'd be happy to answer questions when we get there. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Mike. Excellent. Great to see the multi-state research as well. We're a big fan. So let's take our last 5 minutes here and get to some of the questions. So our first question is from Melissa. She asks, and I think this was primarily for Jake, what is the cost of placing a wetland at the end of a tile drain? Is it economical?
Yeah, I might ask for some clarification there. So I think primarily these wetlands are already in place. It's more about just farmers putting in these corrugated pipes, and they're ending up in a outfall, and those outfalls are just going to go to the lowest, part of the land, which are typically wetlands. So generally speaking, I think they are just at the end of wetlands. I don't know if you would actually create a wetland for that per se, but yeah.
And just quickly, maybe Melissa. Okay, all right. I'm going to go. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, to follow up with that, yeah, mainly these are the farmers create the tile drain systems, and they just empty into natural wetland areas, which are having effects. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm going to ask Hunter's question here, but I may have a follow-up question for you. But to go to Hunter's question, Mike, could you elaborate on some of the alterations used to restore or alter wetland for marsh bird species?
Yeah, I'll talk about alteration to the wetlands first. There are a number of things that have been done, but in the area we've been working on for that project in the northern lower and upper peninsula of Michigan, a lot of the alterations is primarily ditching or very shallow surface drainage furrows that are, many of these areas have very heavy lake plain clay soils, so it's really designed to help get that surface water off of the landscape, especially with the spring snow melt. So that's kind of on the drainage side. On the flooding side, for waterfowl, it's usually a system of low-level dikes that are created along with water control structures, so usually stop log type structures. And the restoration work that's been done is usually ditch plugs and plugging some of those ditches, or in shallow drainage furrows, there may be a low-level berm that's created to block those furrows and restore the hydrology. And then in some of the coastal wetlands, there have been dikes that have been opened up, so allowing the Great Lakes to get back to their normal fluctuation.
Great, thanks, Mike. And we'll go a couple minutes over just because we started a couple minutes late. Just so those of you, of course, that need to leave, feel free to do that. But I wanted to get to Aaron's question next. Mike, do you have any preliminary results on differences in bird use between impounded and unimpounded wetlands? And will you be looking at size of wetlands as a variable?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'm so early in the data analysis, I wouldn't want to I wouldn't want to say as far as the results, because I'm still kind of cranking out the analysis. So yeah, I can't really report on that. But the size of the wetlands, I don't think I'm going to be looking at size so much. It's kind of difficult because the sample unit is usually a point where we're doing surveys. What I'll likely be doing to try and get at that is doing some landscape variables surrounding the points and doing some buffering where we look at the amount of wetland within a particular distance of the point. So, the idea being that a larger wetland, you'll have a greater proportion of the surrounding area will be wetland compared to the sites where you're in a smaller wetland. It's not perfect, but it may be the best we can do.
Great, thank you, Mike. And our final question from Betsy. Jake and Larry, what are your thoughts on farmers' perspectives of wetlands? Do they view them as beneficial to ag or negative? And actually that gets to my follow-up question, which is, for Jake, it seemed like there were some definite values to the wetlands in the landscape in terms of reducing some of those potential pollutants coming out of tile drains.
Right, yeah, so I guess I'll answer the part first. I mean, I think farmers are people, so they have all different types of perspectives. I wouldn't group them as a monolith, really. I think some farmers view them as incredibly valuable, particularly if if they're duck hunters and things like that. Others, I think, on their own land, ultimately, a lot of farmers are more business-minded, and then therefore will want to, if it's on their own land, drain those wetlands to create more, harvestable crop. So I think, generally speaking, I mean, we sort of understand wetlands to be these important processors of things like nutrients and those sorts of ideas, which we find to be true. But also it leaves the question of what a quote-unquote natural state of a wetland is and how much nutrients, if it receives these massive inputs of nutrients, it can deal with them. But that might alter the effect of the wetland itself. And and even just the sort of things that Mike is talking about in his talk, we see shifts in vegetation over these wetland systems over the past 10 years. How much of that is due to these types of practices, it's hard to pin down, but I think these are sort of the open questions that are there. I think we've succeeded. I think historically wetlands were seen as nasty things that generated a lot of biting insects. We've moved the marketing to them being nice areas to produce animals, but I think there's a lot of people that still fall somewhere between those, frankly.
Yeah, I think in here further north, the views are pretty much similar here. There's people that like them, the people don't like them. It depends. If you're a large farmer and you've got some of these really small things on land that you could run a big piece of equipment through, they're looked at as a pain. They like to get rid of them. And one of the issues out here right now is that in North Dakota, at least, just like South Dakota, we probably have more intensity of drainage up here, particularly in the eastern part of the state, which is not exactly a it's the Agassiz, Lake Agassiz lake plain, and so there's a lot of wet areas in there, and wetlands are kind of seen as a real problem because they have to be identified, they have to be mitigated if they drain them, this sort of thing. On the till plain, it just depends. The larger ones are, I think, pretty well accepted. The small, the types we were looking at, some of them the farmers like to get rid of because they've got a farm around them. So it's a mixed bag. I don't think there's any one view or another. It's all over the place.
Great. Well, thanks to you all. And we do have a couple other questions in there. I don't know if our presenters can stick around for another couple minutes to answer those. So I'll just check in with them quickly. But we do have one from Greg asking about any difference in how Restored Wetlands act, especially for restored basins. And then asking about Brian asking about new strategies to help fund projects related to state nutrient reduction strategies. Those are pretty detailed questions. So maybe we'll just take Greg's because he came in there first. And Brian, if you could follow up with our presenters, we'll do that so we can finish up here. So any comments from our presenters about how Restored Wetlands act, especially for restored basins?
I really can't answer that honestly. I know of some that have been restored, but a lot of them have been on more related to fish and wildlife projects and things like that rather than on actual landowners' lands. Most of the time, I think they, by plugging them or by deepening them, back to somewhat of a normal depth, they've been functionality appears to be pretty good, but restoration is usually done out of a necessity, not necessarily out of choice.
Thank you, Larry. Okay. Well, thanks everyone for joining us. Larry, Jake, Mike, great presentations. Really appreciate your time, and thanks to all of you who participated. Thanks to our technical support for keeping us going here. And I'll just give a quick plug for our upcoming webinars. Next one is May 18th, sponsored by the Soil Health Nexus, a team with the North Central Region Water Network, animal manure impact on soil properties. And then our next current webinar on June 13th, soil health parameters and water quality, looking at how we measure soil health. Hot topic there. So join the Soil Health Nexus in May 18th and us on June 13th. Thanks so much and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.